The 18th cassette of this Bible study lecture series brings you two more verse-by-verse lessons from the book of Genesis, taught by Dr. Howard C. Estep, president of World Prophetic Ministry, Incorporated. Let's go to the King is Coming Auditorium at Colton, California, where Dr. Estep is beginning to teach from Genesis chapter 38, verse 25.
Turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 38. And we're taking a quick look at verses 25 through 26, which is Judah repents to protect himself. And then the last section of chapter 38 is Tamar gives birth to Pharez and Zerah in verses 27 through 30. And may I just inject this? You may not know this. It won't do you any harm to know it. But chapter 38 is a parenthetical chapter, meaning to say that it does not necessarily fit into the chronological picture, because chapter 38 should have followed chapter 33. That is, the events depicted in 38 should have followed chapter 33. So we have those two parts there in chapter 38, and then we go into chapter 39. And that part of the outline is divided into 5 sections. 1, Joseph tested in Egypt, verses 1 through 2 of chapter 39. Number 2, God blesses Joseph, verses 3 through 13. 3, Joseph wrongly accused, verses 14 through 18. And 4, Joseph in prison, verses 19 through 20, and then 5, which is lastly, the Lord was with Joseph, verses 21 through 23. And that will conclude that particular study for us. So let's pick up those last few verses in chapter 38. 1, Judah repents to protect himself, verses 25 through 26, when she was brought forth. This she here is Tamar. Judah had a love affair with Tamar. He thought she was a prostitute, so he had an affair with her. And then in verse 18, if you'll notice, she got some identification from him, because she said, "What pledge shall I give thee?" And she said, "Thy signet and thy bracelets and thy staff." In other words, when he had this affair with Tamar, he gave her his signet, his bracelet, and his staff. Now he had an affair with her. Down in verse 25, and when she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, because she has found herself with child, "By the man whose these are, am I with child." So she had these identifications. She had this bracelet and the signet and the staff. So she had this man's possessions. And she was pregnant. And she said, "Whoever owns these is the man that got me into this condition." What she's saying in verse 25. "By the man who these are, am I with child?" And she said, "Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet and bracelets and the staff?" Because in verse 24, Judah had said, "Bring her forth and let her be burnt." They're going to kill her because of the whoredom in which she supposedly found herself. Now she's clearing herself, because she's saying in so many words, "I'm not the bad woman that some people might think I am. This bracelet and signet ring and this staff, this belongs to a man who got me into this condition, and this happened to be Judah." Notice what it says in verse 26. "And Judah acknowledged them and said, She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Selah my son, and he knew her again no more." So he's saying that this woman, supposedly a woman of the street who really was not, that she was more righteous than I, because he was the cause of her sinning. If he had not propositioned her, she would not have sinned, but he was the cause of it, and he became a partner in the sin. Therefore, now he's withdrawing his pledge or his demand that we take her outside the city, let's stone her to death, and let's burn her. No, that's the whole thing is changed around, because it says in verse 26, she hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son. He should have let his son marry her after her husband died, etc., but he didn't, so forth. And what happened is in verses 27 through 30, and it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, or a cord. A scarlet cord, saying, this one came out first. In other words, this child was born first. Verse 29, and it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother was born next, or came out. And she said, how hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. This breach be upon thee. Breach because he broke forth and was born before his brother. He was in the direct line from Adam to Christ. And this is why this parenthetical chapter is inserted here. It shows that the Messiah came of Judah and Pharez. Judah had married, left his brethren, and become an independent stockman. And afterwards, verse 30 says, came out his brother that had the scarlet thread or cord upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. So we have here, Judah repents to protect himself, because he was going to get into trouble. If he had pursued the thought of stoning this woman to death and burning her, he would have been involved also, because he would be thus guilty and would have come under the same jurisdiction. And so then she gave birth to twins. We move into chapter 29. We leave the parenthetical explanation of this particular story, and we move to chapter 39, where we have the life of Joseph beginning. From now throughout the book of Genesis, we'll be dealing with Joseph. And it's quite interesting. We've broken it down into 5 parts, as we said earlier. We look at the first section, Joseph tested in Egypt, verses 1 through 2. Verse 1 says, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites. We saw earlier in our study of Genesis, verse by verse, that the brothers of Joseph sold him into bondage. They traded him off to the Ishmaelite camel train as it was on its way down to Egypt. And then you will remember that they took his coat and they dipped it in the blood of a kid goat, took the coat to the aged father and said, your boy that you love so much is dead. Evidently a wild beast attacked him, so forth. So that's the story that they tried to pawn off on the old man. Now we find Joseph down in Egypt. He is put under the control of Potiphar, who is in charge of men who are specially going to be used in the temple or in the palace of Pharaoh. It says here, which had brought him down thither. And you must remember, God is in this whole affair. God is overseeing this, because when Joseph's brothers were out on the hillside tending their sheep, and Joseph was sent out to look for them, he went in one direction, and then he met a man who said, no, they're not over there. I saw them go over this way. And Joseph turned and went in another direction, and he found his brothers near a little town that was on the route of the camel traders, or the Ishmaelites, who were running a camel train from the land of Canaan all the way down to Egypt. And God had him go over there. You see, sometimes strange things happen in our lives, and at the time they're happening, we wonder why. We try to explain, well, maybe we're a little bit embarrassed because of things that might happen. We say, well, people are going to think funny of me. I changed my mind. I was going to do this. Now I'm going to do that. But you see, if we're true Christians, we have to be ready for change anytime. God directs us one way, and then He may change and direct us another way. This is what happened to Joseph. He was supposed to have been killed. And he would have been killed, but one of the brothers got the idea, let's don't kill him, let's sell him. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, going down into Egypt. This is God. God's behind this whole thing. And here we find him in verses 1 through 2 down in Egypt. Verse 2 says, and the Lord was with Joseph. It's amazing, isn't it? The Lord was with Joseph. In other words, God blessed all he did, as in the case when God is with one. When God's with you, God blesses everything you do. If God's with you, if God is behind you 100%, and God is causing you to pursue His will, God always blesses. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was prosperous, a very prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. He's supposed to have been dead. They threw him in a well, an abandoned water well. He's supposed to die. But he winds up in the palace of Pharaoh down in Egypt. God has a marvelous way of bringing things around, so if we just be patient and wait on God, it'll come to pass in the right way. Let's look at our second part in chapter 39. God blesses Joseph, verses 3 through 13. 3 says, and his master saw that the Lord was with him. That's a good statement. The Egyptians could see that there was something unusual about this Israelite, Joseph, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. The Bible says that if we are in the will of God, that God will cause even our enemies to be at peace with us. And our enemies will see that God is blessing us. And God's proving this here in the 3rd verse, because the Egyptians could see that this man was different, completely different. Verse 4, and Joseph found grace in his sight, in the sight of Potiphar, the head of the guard of the Egyptians, the palace of Pharaoh. Joseph the Jew, the Israelite, found grace in his sight, and he served him. You see, before you can be a boss, or before you can be a ruler, or before you can be in charge of something, you have to learn to be a servant. This is one of the hardest things for American people to get out or to learn, is if you really want to be a good person and get to the top of the ladder and be well thought of and to be someone that has a place of authority, you have to learn to serve. You see, if you serve God in a lowly place, God will exalt you in a higher place. Because whenever you are willing to do the lowest job at the foot of the ladder, God will put you at the top of the ladder later on when the time comes. We have to learn to serve God. Joseph must have learned that early, because it says here in verse 4, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house. A Jew, an Israelite from up in Canaan, came down to Egypt, came down as a slave. He bought him for a few shekels of silver from the Ishmaelite camel traders. He didn't have much invested in him, but this fellow, this young Israelite, served Potiphar beautifully, and he served him so well. Verse 4 says, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had, he put it into his hand. But Joseph had had a dream earlier, you remember. And God had revealed to Joseph when he was just a young lad back there living with his family, and his brothers were tending the flocks on the hillsides. God had given him a vision of what he was going to do later on in life. And that's why when he told his vision to his brothers, that his brothers got mad at him. Animosity rose up, and they said, let's get rid of this dreamer. Let's wipe him out. He's not going to rule over us. So right here in the 4th verse, the Egyptian has already put Joseph in charge of everything. Verse 5. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. God blessed the heathen, the Egyptians. Blessed everything about Pharaoh's house. For what reason? For this little slave that came down from the land of Canaan. Because God is going to use Joseph. God has a purpose for this young man, and God's allowing him to be tested and tried. And allowing him to be tempered in the furnace of persecution. And good steel is always tempered in the furnace. Slag steel is no good. It has to be in the hot, fiery furnace of testing and persecution. It has to be cooled just at the right degree to become real fine quality steel. God is allowing Joseph through this whole process to become a great leader. Verse 6, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. This word left doesn't mean that he died and gave him his will or something like that. It means that he appointed. He appointed all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Potiphar didn't have to worry about his assets because he had a capable, trustworthy man in charge, and he knew that when Joseph administered his wealth, that it would turn out all right. That's nice to have good Christian people around you that operate the work, and the wife and I go away sometimes for 2 weeks at a time, occasionally 3 weeks at a time. And we won't phone back to the office much over 2 or 3 times in two or 3 weeks. Because we know there's capable people back here. People who are just as interested in this work as we are. And we know that it'll be run correctly. Potiphar had that same feeling about Joseph. Notice what it says in verse 7, and it came to pass after these things, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. Now the devil is going to step in, and the devil always tries to interfere with God's work. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 14, Satan says, I will be like the Most High God. Wherever something is going beautifully, and it's running smoothly, and it's operating most magnificently, and God seems to be in it, you can watch out, the devil will try to get in it. Whether it be a church, or a Sunday school class, or a youth work, or an independent work such as World Prophetic Ministry, or even a home, even a Christian home. The devil will try to interfere. Because the devil loves division. So Joseph is getting along too well down in Egypt. So what happens? Well, Pharaoh's wife. The devil put a thought in her mind, and the thought came that she could use this fella for the lusts of the flesh. Verse 8 says, but he, Joseph, refused. He wouldn't have anything to do with her. And he said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath in my hand. My master doesn't realize how wealthy he is. He doesn't realize the vastness of his assets. And I'm dedicated to him. I'm not going to commit sin. It wouldn't be fair to him. And evidently Joseph said it wouldn't be fair to me and it wouldn't be fair to my God. That's what he's saying here in verse 8. Verse 9, there is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. My master has given me charge of everything that he possesses. And the only thing he has said don't touch is his wife. And here was this wife testing him, trying to seduce him, induce him to commit sin with her. What does he say in the middle of verse 9? How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You see, all sin against man is primarily against God. Sometimes people say, well, I didn't sin against God, I just sinned against man. But sin against man is also sin against God. And though he had sinned against his master by entering into an affair with the master's wife, not only would he have sinned against his master, but he would have sinned against God. And the devil is right there, always trying to trip you. Always putting these suggestive thoughts in your mind. Always putting these little inclinations to sin, just a little bit now and a little bit later on. He doesn't tell you what the eventuality is going to lead to. Verse 10, and it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day, persistent. And with all due respect to the ladies, sometimes they can drive a man over a cliff. You know, you'll have to be nice to me after the service, but, you know, you can take that continual, I hesitate to use the word nagging. There must be a better word, a more sophisticated word, but if continually, my mother used to, when she wanted me to do something, she would keep after me, you know, and pretty soon I'd say, okay, Mom, what is it you want me to do? I'll be happy. Just tell me what it is. 10, and it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house, do his business, work, bookkeeping, whatever he had to do in the administration of his master's wealth. And there was none of the men of the house there within. Just he and the woman inside the house. That's why I always stay in a motel when I go out in a Bible conference. I never stay in the preacher's house. No, sirree, you couldn't tie me down and keep me in the house. The devil. You say, what? She's a good Christian woman. The pastor's a good Christian man. What's wrong in staying in the pastor's house? The devil. No, sirree, I'll take a motel and lock the doors and the windows and run the risk of keeping the devil out. All kinds of crazy things happen. Absolutely. Here he is. He's in the house. There's nobody else there but the woman. Verse 12. And she caught him by his garment. She caught him by the cloak, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. He was so frightened and so scared that he just slid out of his coat and took off like a bat out of the bed place. He really took off. Frightened him. He hadn't been around anything like that before. And these Egyptian women, you know, with the painted eyes and the long lashes and the long claws, nails, and he thought the eagles had come to get him. And he said, Lord, deliver me from this calamity, and he took off. He was willing to leave his coat. Verse 13, and it came to pass When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house. Yeah. She's going to wrongly accuse him. I believe there's a lot of men sitting in the penitentiary tonight, wrongly accused by women. You can't just take a woman's word when a woman goes to the police station and say, he raped me. You can't take her word for that. And for so long, the laws of the land have sided with the woman. She comes up and says, he raped me, and so they arrest the guy, throw him in jail. On whose authority? When did her word become better than his word? You must remember that sometimes the female has a devil in him as big as a chipmunk, the same as the man has a devil in him as big as a chipmunk. We have to be careful. And so this she-devil down there in Egypt was trying to get advantage of this, and so she grabbed him his clothes, his cloak, and hung on to it, evidence. And then she called unto the men of her house. Instead of letting the thing drop and forget about it and not say anything, she wanted to make a big display. She called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, see, he hath brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. My husband has purchased a Hebrew slave and brought him into our house, and now he's raped me. Basically, this is what she's going to say. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. She said, when my husband comes home, he is going to raise Cain. Not Cain and Abel, but he's going to raise a different kind of Cain. Notice what? Wait till my husband gets home and hears this. Wait till I tell my husband. And she's the bear cat that started all of this trouble. Verse 17. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant, which thou, speaking to her husband, this Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us, came in unto me to mock me. He came in to disgrace me. He's just a common slave, just an ordinary slave. You bought him for 18 or 20 shekels of silver. You know, just a common slave. You can buy them off of the Ishmaelite camel train every week when the camels come by. And here he is in our house, and he took advantage of me. In verse 18, it came to pass as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and he ran. Fled. What's going to happen? Well, Joseph is going to be put in prison because Pharaoh's not going to put up with that because he believes his wife. He doesn't have any reason not to believe her. This thing has never happened before, evidently. So he's going to have him put in prison. But watch how God moves. You see, whether you're put in prison or out of prison, that doesn't matter. If God's for you, who can be against you? Nobody. So here's the future prime minister of Egypt being put in prison. Notice what it says in verses 19 through 20. And it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. Pharaoh became so mad, smoke was coming out of his ears, fire dashing out of his eyeballs. Oh, his teeth were chattering, and he could hardly control himself. His blood pressure went way up to, I would say, 220 over 120. Ready for a heart attack. Verse 20, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. Special prison. Put him into a special prison. They weren't satisfied with the bars and the iron door or gate. They bound him, threw him in there on a cold slab, a cold granite rock. There he is in jail. And he was there in prison. So Joseph is put in prison, verses 19 through 20. What's going to happen? Well, the Lord was with him. You mean to tell me, Brother Estep, this man's accused of sexual misconduct with the wife of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and you mean God was with him? Yeah, God was with him. Well, how could God be with a man like that? You see, my friends, if you're falsely accused, that's all right. If you're falsely accused of something, you have the blessing of God upon you. That's why when we're falsely accused, we shouldn't try to retaliate. It's so easy to retaliate when you're falsely accused. You say, I'm going to protect my name. I'm going to get a hold of this fella. That's not the way it's done. Joseph was put in prison. Now the Lord was with him. In verses 21 through 23, but the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was the one friend Joseph had left who could do anything for him. He later raised up another friend close to the time when Joseph was to be delivered and exalted in Egypt. But God was with him. An accused rapist in jail in Egypt, and he could be put to death any moment. God was with him, verse 21. And the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Isn't that amazing? How's God going to work? Well, God has to change the mind of the sheriff or the deputy or the corporal or the sergeant, whatever title that fellow had. God had to change the mind of that man that was in charge of the prison. So God worked through the prison official. That's what it's saying here in the latter part of verse 21, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now, Pharaoh put him in the prison thinking that we'll put him in there, he'll rot. We'll have a trial when we get around to it. We'll do something with him. But God didn't have that vision at all. God says, you put him in the prison, I'll take care of him. Verse 22. Watch what's happened. And the keeper of the prison, this is funny, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. That's a switch. Joseph got thrown in the clinker. They slammed the door shut. He couldn't get out. And then God says to the prison official, you have this prisoner take charge of all these prisoners. You see, God can do anything. Anything that God wants to do, God can do it. Because God owns the universe. God owns everything that's in the universe. God owns all of the individuals in the universe. He owns all the cattle, all of the animals, all the fowl, all the mineral, all the gold, all the silver, all the fish in the sea. God owns everything, and God can do whatever He wants to do because it's His. Even Pharaoh is His. And so what does God do? Verse 22. The keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Prisoner said, the man in charge of the prison, he said, I've just worked myself. I'm just worked at a frazzle. I'm about to have a nervous breakdown. Joseph, I'm going to keep an eye on you. Don't pull anything funny around here. But I'm going to put you in charge of all these prisoners. The guy that just got thrown in the clinker is going to be put in charge of the prison. It's amazing. He was the doer of it. Verse 23, the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand. He put Joseph in complete authority. Complete authority was invested in Joseph, the Hebrew slave from the land of Canaan. It's his prerogative to do whatever he wants to. Because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So in our 39th chapter, as we begin the study of the life of Joseph, we've seen Joseph tested in Egypt in verses 1 through 2. The second part, Joseph is blessed by God, verses 3 through 13. And thirdly, Joseph is wrongly accused by a woman who had sinister sex ideas in her mind. And fourth, Joseph is thrown into prison after he's wrongly accused. And then 5, the Lord is with him. That makes me think of Daniel, put in the lion's den. And the king thought, sure, Daniel would be eaten up the next morning, but he went down to the cave, the mouth of the cave, and Daniel's sitting down there, probably with his head propped up, resting on the warm belly of one of those lions, and just looking up into the mouth of the cave. And the king says, "You alive, Daniel?" He said, "Yep, I'm okay. Everything's all right. God sent his angels last night and stopped the mouth of this lion." He's lying there about half asleep on the warm belly of a lion. And Christians, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just so nervous. I took 3 sleeping pills last night and I still didn't sleep anything. I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet. And you chew your nails off back up into the quick, and you're nervous and you can't sit still. And, well, God's in charge. God's in charge. Just turn it over to God. And don't rush into anything. Blessed is the man that waiteth on the Lord. When you rush into something, pretty soon you think, boy, if I'd have been a little bit slower, I'd have made more speed than what I'm making now. Don't rush into anything. Give God the opportunity of working in your life and motivating you. Next week, we look at the wisdom of Joseph. And mind you, he was just a little teenage sheep herder up in Canaan, just a few years hence. Just running around the hills. He was his daddy's favorite. His daddy used him as a sort of an office boy. And this young Joseph went out to carry messages for his father as his older brothers were out on the hillside tending the sheep and the goats. But here he is getting prepared to become the prime minister of all of Egypt. And isn't it nice that God starts small? God always starts real small. If God wants to build a great big oak tree that reaches 100 feet up into the sky, oak tree that can stand the winds and the storms of this world, what does God start with? He starts with a squirrel burying an acorn in the ground. God doesn't go out with a 5-gallon barrel and transplant a tree into the soil. He starts with an acorn, hidden by a squirrel that forgets where he puts it. And God raises an oak. God starts small. So God is going to preserve the Hebrew people from a tremendous famine. 7 years when there wasn't anything grown, nothing. What does he do? He sends a little shepherd boy sold to the Ishmaelite camel traders all the way down to Egypt, and God has him put in the house of Pharaoh, and though he's wrongly accused and thrown in jail, God gets in there and turns the hearts of the jailers. I don't know what your circumstances are at home or away from home or where you work. If they are adverse and they're giving you conflict, Stick it out. God has got you there for a purpose.
On the other side of the cassette, you will hear Dr. Estep continue his Genesis study series.